A security guard blocks a black pilot and calls the police to arrest him, but has no idea who he is. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun bathed the sprawling estate of Elijah Brooks in a warm, golden light. His mansion, perched atop the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean, was a marvel of modern architecture. Expansive glass walls reflected the sunlight, while the gentle sound of the waves crashing below added a sense of calm to his otherwise fast-paced life. This was the world Elijah had built for himself, a world of luxury, achievement, and prestige. But today, the serenity of his estate belied the storm brewing ahead. Inside his home, Elijah was already in motion. The rhythmic sound of his shoes against the polished hardwood floors echoed through the hallways. In his hand, he carried a sleek leather briefcase, and his other hand thumbed through his smartphone, reviewing the agenda for the day. It wasn't just another meeting. It was a presentation to a group of investors that could take his company, Skylift Aviation, to unprecedented heights. Skylift Aviation wasn't just a business for Elijah. It was a testament to his journey, his triumph over adversity. After leaving the military, where he had served as a decorated helicopter pilot, Elijah had faced countless challenges in the civilian world. Starting a business in an industry dominated by entrenched players had seemed like an impossible dream, especially for a black man with no financial backing. But Elijah had proven everyone wrong. The mansion was quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds outside. His wife, Clara, met him in the foyer, her warm smile a comforting contrast to the brisk pace of the morning. "Don't forget to breathe," she teased, adjusting his tie. "You always get this focused before big meetings." Elijah chuckled, his deep voice resonating with gratitude. "It's not just any meeting, Clara. These investors could open doors we've been knocking on for years. And besides, I prefer flying myself there. Keeps me grounded. Well, metaphorically speaking." She laughed, her hands lingering on his shoulders. "Just remember, you've already proven yourself. They're lucky to even have a seat at your table." Her words carried the reassurance he needed. With a final kiss on her cheek, Elijah grabbed his flight jacket and stepped into the crisp morning air. His black Range Rover hummed as he navigated the winding roads leading to the private heliport he often used. The sky was a pristine blue, promising perfect flying conditions. As he pulled into the VIP parking area, his eyes caught sight of the gleaming helicopter waiting for him on the tarmac. It was one of Skylift's finest models, a testament to the innovation his company brought to the industry. Elijah parked, stepped out of his car, and began walking toward the terminal. His military-grade pilot's license and the custom-embroidered logo on his flight suit marked him as a professional. Yet, even with all the markers of his success, he had learned to anticipate skepticism. The first sign of trouble came as soon as he approached the terminal entrance. A stocky security guard, arms crossed, blocked his path. The man's badge read, "M. Callahan." "Can I help you?" Callahan's tone was curt, his eyes scanning Elijah with thinly veiled suspicion. "Good morning," Elijah replied, his tone professional. "I'm Elijah Brooks. I'll be piloting the Skylift H-12 on the tarmac. Here are my credentials." He extended his documents, a laminated pilot's license, his company ID, and the flight plan pre-approved by the terminal. Callahan glanced at the documents but made no move to take them. Instead, he chuckled dryly. "That's cute," Callahan said, his lips curling into a smirk. "But this area is restricted. You can't just walk in here and claim you're a pilot." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I understand your need for security. Please, take a closer look at my credentials. You'll see everything is in order." Callahan didn't budge. Instead, he gestured toward a nearby intercom. "Look, buddy, I don't know how you got these documents, but you need to leave before I call the cops. This isn't a playground for anyone who doesn't belong." Elijah felt the sting of the unspoken words. He had encountered bias before, but the brazenness of Callahan's behavior was startling. He glanced at his watch. Time was ticking, and he needed to get airborne. "I'm the owner of Skylift Aviation," Elijah said firmly. "The helicopter on your tarmac belongs to me. If you need further verification, call your supervisor or contact my office. But I'm not leaving." Callahan's smirk faded, replaced by a hardened glare. He stepped closer, his posture growing more aggressive. "I've been working here for years, and I know when someone's trying to pull a fast one. Now turn around and get back in your car before I make this official." Elijah's instincts as a pilot kicked in. He assessed the situation like he would a turbulent flight: stay calm, evaluate options, and act decisively. "Mr. Callahan," Elijah said, his voice even, "I don't want to escalate this, but I will not be treated like this. Either let me proceed, or call someone who can verify my identity." The exchange began to draw attention. Other travelers in business attire passed through the terminal without a glance from Callahan, while Elijah remained blocked. A few bystanders stopped to watch, murmuring amongst themselves. One man, wearing a tailored suit and carrying an expensive briefcase, paused long enough to recognize Elijah. "Wait, isn't that Elijah Brooks, the guy who owns Skylift?" he said aloud, loud enough for Callahan to hear. Callahan turned red but doubled down. "Move along, sir," he barked at the man. Elijah's patience was wearing thin. He pulled out his phone and quickly texted his assistant, instructing them to contact the terminal management. Minutes passed, each second feeling like an eternity. The quiet confidence Elijah usually carried was tested, but he refused to let anger take over. Instead, he stood firm, his documents still in hand, as Callahan called for backup on his radio. The morning, so promising and bright, had taken a sharp turn. Elijah knew this wasn't just about today. It was a reflection of something deeper, a system that often judged him not by his achievements, but by his appearance. As the first echoes of approaching security reinforcements reached his ears, Elijah took a deep breath. This was far from over. The reinforcement arrived swiftly, 3 additional security guards marching toward the terminal entrance with an air of authority. Their presence only added weight to the oppressive atmosphere surrounding Elijah Brooks. He remained calm, his pilot's license and credentials still held out in his hand. Around him, murmurs from the growing crowd of onlookers filled the air like static. The lead guard, a tall man with a badge reading S. Garrison, stepped forward. His eyes flicked to the documents in Elijah's hand, but made no move to take them. "What's the situation here, Callahan?" Garrison asked, his tone neutral but firm. Callahan, emboldened by the backup, gestured toward Elijah with a dismissive wave. "This guy's claiming to be a pilot. Says he's flying out of here on the Skylift chopper. Documents look fake to me." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to keep his voice level. "Mr. Garrison, I've explained to Mr. Callahan that I'm Elijah Brooks, the owner of Skylift Aviation and a licensed pilot. My credentials are legitimate, and my helicopter is right there on your tarmac." Garrison's gaze shifted to Elijah's uniform, then back to his face. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, but it was quickly replaced by a look of practiced authority. "Sir, I'll need you to step aside while we verify your information," Garrison said. Elijah inhaled deeply, controlling the frustration bubbling under the surface. I'm happy to comply, but I've already asked Mr. Callahan to contact someone from terminal management or to call my office. There's no need for further delays. Garrison raised a hand, cutting him off. Let us handle this. If your story checks out, you'll be on your way. The condescension in his tone wasn't lost on Elijah. He glanced at his watch. Every passing minute was another step closer to missing his meeting. Behind him, the whispers among the crowd grew louder. A woman in a business suit whispered to the man beside her, "Why don't they just check his documents? This seems unnecessary." Another voice chimed in, "I've seen him in Forbes. That's definitely Elijah Brooks." The mounting tension reached a new peak as a patrol car pulled up to the curb, red and blue lights flashing. 2 police officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts. One of them, a stocky man with a buzz cut, adjusted his sunglasses as he approached. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded, his gaze fixed on Elijah. Callahan was quick to answer. "This guy's trying to bluff his way into the terminal. Claims he's a pilot, but we think he's up to something shady." Elijah's pulse quickened, but his exterior remained composed. "Officer, I'm Elijah Brooks. I own Skylift Aviation, and I'm piloting the helicopter on your tarmac. I've provided my credentials, and I'm happy to cooperate, but this situation is getting out of hand." The officer's lips curled into a thin line. "Let me see those credentials." Finally, someone was willing to examine them. Elijah handed over his documents, watching as the officer glanced at them briefly before turning to Callahan. "You ran these?" the officer asked. "No," Callahan replied. "Didn't need to. It's obvious." "Obvious?" Elijah interjected, his tone sharp but controlled. "What's obvious, Mr. Callahan? That I don't fit your expectations of who should be flying a helicopter or owning a company like Skylift." The officer frowned. "Calm down, sir. Let's not make this worse than it needs to be." Elijah's frustration flared, but he swallowed it down. "I'm not the one escalating this situation. All I've asked is for someone to verify my identity. Your terminal management or my company's office can confirm everything." The second officer, a younger man who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Let's call this in and verify his story." But before they could act, Callahan's voice cut through the conversation. "We don't need to call anyone. This guy's lying and we're wasting time. Just look at him." The insinuation hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a woman's voice. "That's enough," she called out. All heads turned to see an elderly man in a tailored suit step forward. His voice was steady and authoritative. "I've seen this man on the cover of business magazines. That is Elijah Brooks, and he's exactly who he says he is." Callahan scoffed, but the older man's presence seemed to give others the courage to speak. "Yeah, I've seen him too," said a young woman holding her phone. "He's the CEO of Skylift. I'm live streaming this and thousands of people are already watching." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of the situation beginning to dawn on them. "Sir," the younger officer said to Elijah, his tone softer now, "let's get this sorted. We'll call your company to confirm." Elijah nodded, but before anyone could make the call, a new figure appeared on the scene. A tall man in a crisp suit approached, his expression a mix of urgency and disbelief. "Mr. Brooks," the man said, his voice loud enough to cut through the commotion. "I'm the terminal manager. I'm so sorry for this confusion. We've just been contacted by your office and I've confirmed everything. You're cleared for immediate access." The air seemed to shift. Callahan's face turned pale, and the officers stepped back, their authority suddenly diminished. The crowd murmured in a mixture of relief and outrage. Elijah met the manager's gaze, his voice steady but laced with steel. This situation should never have escalated to this point. I'll proceed to my flight, but I expect a full report on how this was allowed to happen. Of course, sir, the manager stammered. Again, my sincerest apologies. As Elijah walked toward the terminal, the crowd parted for him and the whispers began anew. The weight of what had just transpired pressed heavily on him. This wasn't just about today. This was about a system that saw him as suspect first and competent second. And, as much as he wanted to leave it behind, he knew this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. Elijah Brooks stepped through the sliding glass doors of the private terminal, his documents still clenched in his hand. The hum of distant engines reverberated through the small terminal, blending with the murmurs of the crowd. His face remained composed, but an inferno of emotion blazed beneath his calm exterior. Anger, frustration, and the weariness of 1,000 similar moments that had led him to this point. He felt the stares on him like a physical weight, each glance reminding him that no matter his success, his appearance still invited doubt. The terminal manager, who had so hastily intervened, was trailing slightly behind, issuing apologies that sounded hollow in the current atmosphere. Elijah wasn't listening. His mind was somewhere else, oscillating between the present indignity and the memories of his past. He remembered the first time he had experienced blatant discrimination. He had been a newly minted pilot in the Army, fresh out of flight school, filled with excitement and ready to serve his country. But instead of the camaraderie he had expected, he was met with skepticism from a few fellow servicemen who openly questioned his ability to fly. They hadn't even bothered to hide their prejudices, and at that time he had fought to prove himself, often in silence. Today, those echoes from the past seemed louder than ever. He had worked tirelessly since then, building a career, then a company, turning Skylift Aviation into a symbol of quality and service. He had survived life-threatening missions, navigated impossible weather conditions, and handled the high stakes of the business world. But none of that seemed to matter at this moment. All it took was a security guard with a narrow mindset to bring back that same feeling of being unwelcome and unworthy. "Sir, please understand," the terminal manager said, struggling to keep pace. "This situation is beyond unacceptable. We are taking measures." "Enough," Elijah interrupted, his voice steely, stopping in his tracks. He turned to face the manager, his gaze piercing. "Apologies aren't enough. You let your people operate with unchecked authority and ignorance. If it weren't for my contacts, how far would this have gone?" The manager faltered, words escaping him. Before he could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps reverberated through the terminal. Elijah turned his head and saw them, 2 police officers making their way toward him, and behind them, Callahan, his expression still twisted in misplaced determination. It seemed that the confrontation was far from over. "Mr. Brooks, these officers will need to have a word with you," Callahan sneered, his voice barely masking his delight. The crowd had yet to disperse, their interest renewed by the appearance of law enforcement. Elijah took a deep breath. He had handled pressure before, both in the cockpit and in the boardroom, but this was different. He knew all too well that situations like these could turn in an instant, and he needed to maintain control. "Mr. Brooks," said the lead officer, a man whose eyes seemed to dart between Elijah and the murmuring crowd, as if calculating his moves for the growing audience. "We received a call regarding a potential security breach. We need to ask you some questions." Elijah stared at the officer, feeling the tension build within him. He could hear Clara's voice in his head, urging him to stay calm, to breathe. He understood the stakes. He couldn't afford to let his emotions dictate his actions now. The crowd, some of whom were already recording the interaction, were expecting him to lose his composure. He would not give them that satisfaction. "You're welcome to ask questions, officer, but I want to make something clear." Elijah's voice cut through the noise, his tone as unyielding as his posture. "This is not a security breach. I am Elijah Brooks, the owner of Skylift Aviation. I have provided all of my credentials, which your colleagues have refused to verify." The younger officer looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He glanced at the terminal manager, whose face had grown more ashen with each passing second. The lead officer, however, wasn't done. "We still need to confirm everything, sir. Until then, we'd ask that you remain where you are." "That's enough," someone called out from the crowd, a middle-aged man in a business suit. He pushed his way through the gathering of onlookers, his expression fierce. "What the hell are you people doing? That's Elijah Brooks. I've seen him on TV. The man owns the company. How can you not know this?" The officer stiffened, his jaw tightening. Callahan, however, seemed even more emboldened, ignoring the outcry from the crowd. "This isn't about what he says he owns," Callahan said, his voice rising. "We're dealing with protocols here, and I'm doing my job." "Your job?" Elijah repeated, his voice quiet but cutting. He turned to face Callahan fully, the muscles in his shoulders taut with barely controlled frustration. "Your job is to enforce rules based on facts, not your personal biases." Callahan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could utter a word, Elijah raised his phone, its screen lit up with a number already dialed. The call connected, and he spoke clearly, his voice carrying through the terminal. "This is Elijah Brooks. I need an immediate verification of my identity for a flight out of the LAX private terminal. There has been an unacceptable delay, and security is refusing to cooperate." The air seemed to shift. The terminal grew quieter as the gravity of what Elijah had just done settled in. Callahan's face paled, and the lead officer's expression shifted from hardened authority to something else: uncertainty. The terminal manager quickly stepped forward, nearly stumbling over his own feet in his rush. "Mr. Brooks, please. There's no need for that. We can resolve this right here." Elijah's gaze didn't waver. He could feel the weight of the crowd's stares, their attention fixed on him, waiting for what would happen next. For a moment, the silence was overpowering, the entire terminal frozen, caught in the tension of the moment. But before the terminal manager could say anything further, a new voice broke through the silence, a firm, clear voice that carried with it authority and command. "Step back from Mr. Brooks immediately," the voice ordered. All heads turned, and Elijah saw them, two men in suits flanked by a woman in a sharp blazer. The man at the front, whose badge bore the title Regional Director, walked toward them, his expression severe. "Mr. Brooks," the regional director said, his eyes locking onto Elijah's, "I sincerely apologize for what has happened here today. You have every right to be where you are, and I am personally ensuring that you are escorted to your helicopter without further delay." Elijah could feel the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, though the storm of emotions within him still raged. He nodded, acknowledging the director's words, but said nothing. The lead officer stepped back, his posture deflating, and Callahan looked like he had swallowed something sour. The director turned to Callahan, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You and I will be having a conversation in my office immediately. As for the rest of you," he said, addressing the other guards and the officers, "this is not how we operate. This kind of treatment is unacceptable and will be dealt with accordingly." The woman in the blazer stepped forward, extending a hand to Elijah. "I'm Olivia Grant from Terminal Management. Please allow me to escort you personally to your helicopter." Elijah looked at her for a moment, then took her hand, his grip firm. The crowd watched as Olivia led him through the terminal, the murmurs growing louder in his wake. He could hear snippets of their conversations, expressions of outrage, sympathy, disbelief. As they approached the exit to the tarmac, Olivia glanced at Elijah, her expression genuinely remorseful. "Mr. Brooks, I can't apologize enough. We've already contacted your team, and they are expecting you on board." "Thank you, Miss Grant," Elijah replied, his voice calm but distant. They stepped out onto the tarmac, the sunlight blinding after the dimness of the terminal. There, gleaming in the sun, was the Skylift helicopter, its blades already spinning slowly in preparation for takeoff. The ground crew stood nearby, each of them visibly anxious, their eyes fixed on Elijah as he approached. The pilot, a young man with dark hair and a nervous smile, stepped forward, saluting Elijah. "Sir, everything is ready. We're good to go." Elijah nodded, climbing into the cockpit, his fingers brushing over the familiar controls. The helicopter was his sanctuary, a place where he had always found freedom, a freedom that had been so easily threatened by ignorance and prejudice today. As he strapped himself in, Elijah glanced out the window at the terminal, where the crowd still lingered, many with phones held aloft, documenting every moment. He knew that what had just transpired would not be forgotten. It would spread, and it would spark conversations that were long overdue. But, for now, he had a flight to complete, a mission to focus on. He put on his headset, gave a thumbs up to the crew, and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as the helicopter lifted off the ground. The city stretched out below him, and as the helicopter ascended, Elijah felt a mix of emotions: relief, frustration, and something else: resolve. Today had been another reminder of the battles that still lay ahead, even for someone who had already fought and won so many. As the helicopter soared over the skyline, Elijah knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. What had happened on the ground today would not be forgotten. It would fuel him, propel him forward, just as the rotors carried him higher, away from the turmoil below. Elijah Brooks guided the helicopter through the air, the rhythmic hum of the blades steadying him after the turmoil of the morning. The sun bathed the cityscape below, but despite the beauty of the view, his thoughts were far from serene. The events of the past hour echoed in his mind. Every dismissive look, every assumption that he didn't belong, that he was something less than what he had worked so hard to become. The sky had always represented freedom to Elijah, but today even his sanctuary felt tainted. As he gained altitude, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen on the console. It was Clara, his wife. He flicked on his headset's Bluetooth, and her voice came through, warm but laced with worry. "Elijah, are you okay?" she asked. He could hear the tension in her voice, her concern for what she must have heard through his hurried text updates and the rapid spread of the story. Elijah took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I'm okay, Clara. It got ugly, but I'm in the air now, heading to San Francisco." There was a pause, and he could imagine her closing her eyes, taking in the gravity of what he had said. "I hate that this keeps happening," she finally whispered. "You shouldn't have to go through this again and again, Elijah. You've worked too hard." He swallowed, his hands tightening on the controls. "I know, but today was different. People saw it. There were dozens of witnesses, and they recorded everything. Maybe this time it will actually make a difference." "Maybe," she agreed softly, though neither of them sounded entirely convinced. "Just come home safe, okay?" "Always," he said, and they ended the call. He refocused on the flight, the rhythmic sounds of the helicopter's engine grounding him. It was a 2-hour journey to San Francisco, and he allowed the routine to calm his nerves. The systematic checks, the minor adjustments to altitude, the rhythm that had become second nature to him over years of flying. But even in the air, he couldn't escape the weight of the morning. Every time he glanced at his reflection in the windshield, he saw more than just his pilot's uniform. He saw the barriers that he had thought he had left behind. It seemed that no amount of success could erase them completely. He had been treated not as an accomplished pilot or a business leader, but as a suspect. By the time he reached San Francisco, the anger had settled into something else: determination. As he approached the landing pad at the private aviation terminal, his resolve hardened. This was not going to end with apologies and promises from the terminal staff. This was going to become a statement. Later that afternoon, Elijah sat in a conference room at the investment firm's headquarters in downtown San Francisco. The meeting had gone well. The investors had been enthusiastic about his vision for expanding Skylift's services, and they had appreciated his hands-on approach, literally flying himself there to meet them. Yet, as he sat there, listening to the final summary from the investment committee, Elijah's mind drifted. He watched as one of the investors, a young man with slicked-back hair and an expensive suit, scrolled through his phone. Suddenly, the man's eyes widened, and he shot Elijah an incredulous look. "Mr. Brooks, is this you?" he asked, turning the phone screen toward Elijah. The screen showed a video, grainy footage, shot by someone in the crowd at the private terminal earlier that day. It showed Elijah standing calmly as the guards berated him, as Callahan's voice rose, full of venom and doubt. In the video, Elijah was holding out his credentials, trying to explain himself, while the guards ignored every word. Elijah nodded slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, that's me." The other investors leaned in, their faces a mix of shock and sympathy. The young man looked back at the screen, shaking his head. "This is unacceptable. I mean, you're Elijah Brooks." Elijah felt a bitter smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Apparently, not everyone knows that," he said, his voice even. The room fell silent, the weight of the video hanging between them. Finally, one of the senior investors cleared his throat, his voice filled with gravity. "Mr. Brooks, I think I speak for everyone here when I say that what happened to you was wrong. If there's anything we can do—" Elijah nodded, his eyes meeting those of each person around the table. "There is, actually," he said. "This isn't just about me. What happened today happens to people all the time, people who don't have the platform or the resources to fight back. I want to use this moment to create real change, and I need partners who are willing to support that." The investors exchanged glances, and the young man nodded, his expression resolute. "Consider us on board, Mr. Brooks, whatever you need." For the first time that day, Elijah allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be the time that things changed. The sun was setting by the time Elijah returned to Los Angeles, his helicopter touching down at his private hangar. The tarmac was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the morning. Elijah climbed out of the cockpit, his muscles aching from the long day. As he walked across the hangar, he saw a familiar figure waiting by the door. Olivia Grant, the woman from terminal management who had escorted him earlier. "Mr. Brooks," she called, her voice hesitant. Elijah stopped, turning to face her. Her expression was earnest, a mix of apology and determination. "I wanted to speak with you before I left for the day," she said. "I know what happened this morning was wrong, and I can't express how deeply I regret that you went through that here at our facility. I've spoken with my superiors, and we want to do whatever we can to make this right." Elijah studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "What I want, Miss Grant, is systemic change. Not just apologies after the fact, but a commitment to ensuring this doesn't happen again, to me or to anyone else." She met his gaze, and Elijah could see the sincerity in her eyes. "I understand. We're going to be conducting a full investigation into the actions of the guards involved. And more than that, we're reevaluating our entire training process. I know it's just words right now, but I want you to know that we are taking this seriously." Elijah let out a slow breath, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Good, because I am too. This isn't going to be swept under the rug, Miss Grant. I'll be expecting to see real changes, and I'll be holding your organization accountable." She nodded, her face flushing slightly. "You have my word, Mr. Brooks. Thank you for your patience." He gave her a curt nod before turning to head back to his car. As he approached the Range Rover, he could see the reflection of the hangar in its dark windows, his helicopter, the setting sun, and Olivia still standing there, watching him. He climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment, staring out at the hangar. Today had been a stark reminder that no matter how far he had come, there were still battles to fight. But this time, he was ready to take that fight to a larger stage. The investors were on board, the media had picked up the story, and the momentum was building. As he started the engine, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one bad experience at an airport. This was about changing an entire system that treated people differently based on prejudices, no matter how high they had climbed. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, he knew that. But as he drove away from the hangar, the sky darkening around him, Elijah felt the determination settle in his bones. He had faced turbulence before, and he had always made it through. This time would be no different. And as he looked out at the fading light on the horizon, Elijah knew that the real flight was just beginning. The next morning, Elijah Brooks woke up to a whirlwind. Even before he had fully opened his eyes, he could feel the buzz, his phone vibrating incessantly on the nightstand, the glow of notifications flooding the room. It wasn't the typical business emails or investor queries. It was something bigger, something that carried a different energy. He reached for his phone, his eyes adjusting to the bright screen, and scrolled through the messages. There were countless texts from colleagues, messages from friends and family, and a dozen missed calls. But it was the barrage of social media notifications that caught his attention. Mentions, retweets, comments, all tied to a video that had evidently gone viral. Elijah sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes. Clara was already awake, leaning against the doorway of their bedroom with her arms crossed, her face a mixture of concern and something else, determination. "Morning," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. He nodded, glancing at her before turning back to his phone. The video was there. Shared across platforms, reposted by influential figures, and accompanied by hashtags that had gained traction overnight. He opened one of the videos, watching the scene unfold from an outsider's perspective. Himself, standing there with his credentials in hand, while Callahan barked orders and the police arrived. The comments beneath the video were a mix of outrage, support, and disbelief. This is what systemic discrimination looks like. Elijah Brooks, owner of Skylift, treated like a criminal just because of his skin color. Unacceptable. Unbelievable. The guy literally owns the company, and they wouldn't even listen to him. This needs to change. Respect to Elijah for staying calm in a situation that would push anyone else over the edge. Clara moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. It's everywhere, Elijah. News channels have picked it up. I even saw it on CNN this morning. He looked up at her, a frown creasing his forehead. CNN? Seriously? She nodded. It's a national story now. People are angry, and they're calling for accountability. The terminal's already issued a statement, but it's, well, you know how those things are. Empty apologies. Elijah sighed, leaning back against the headboard. He had known, even in the moment, that what was happening was significant, that it would resonate with people far beyond the terminal. But he hadn't anticipated this. The story had taken on a life of its own. He handed the phone to Clara, who took it and scrolled through the comments. People are looking at you as a symbol now, Elijah. They see what happened to you, and they want change. They're demanding it. He nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. He could feel the weight of it, the expectations, the hope that people were placing on him. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was, whether he wanted it or not, a representative for a larger movement. Then we have to use this, he said finally, his voice steady. We can't let it die down. We need to make sure this actually leads to change. Clara smiled, a hint of pride in her eyes. I knew you'd say that. Later that morning, Elijah arrived at the Skylift Aviation headquarters. The building was sleek and modern, a testament to the success he had built from the ground up. As he walked through the lobby, he noticed the way the staff looked at him, respect, admiration, and a hint of something else, solidarity. His assistant, Rebecca, was waiting for him by the elevators, her phone in hand and a determined look on her face. Mr. Brooks, the phones have been ringing off the hook since 6 this morning. News outlets, civil rights organizations, even some politicians. Everyone wants a statement from you. Elijah nodded as they stepped into the elevator. Schedule a press conference for this afternoon. I want to address this directly. Rebecca glanced at him, her eyebrows raising slightly. A press conference? Are you sure? This is a pretty big stage. I know, Elijah replied, and that's exactly why we need to do it. People are paying attention, and we have a chance to make a difference. She nodded, her fingers already moving across her phone screen to make the necessary arrangements. As the elevator ascended, Elijah's mind was racing, formulating the message he wanted to convey. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about the thousands of people who faced similar situations every day, people who didn't have a platform to speak from. When they reached his office, Elijah took a moment to look out over the city. The skyscrapers stretched toward the sky, the sun glinting off their glass facades. This was his city, his world, one he had fought to be a part of. And now it was time to fight for others. The press conference was held in the afternoon in a large conference room at Skylift's headquarters. Reporters from major news outlets filled the room, cameras set up at the back, their lenses trained on the podium at the front. The buzz of conversation filled the air, journalists exchanging notes, adjusting microphones, preparing for the story that had captured the nation's attention. Elijah stood behind the podium, his expression calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. He could see Clara standing at the back of the room, her presence a steadying force. He took a deep breath, the room falling silent as he began to speak. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Thank you all for being here today. I'm Elijah Brooks, CEO of Skylift Aviation. As many of you are aware, I was involved in an incident yesterday at a private terminal here in Los Angeles. An incident that, unfortunately, is not unique to me." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. "Yesterday, I was treated as a suspect, not because of my actions, but because of the assumptions made about me based on my appearance. Despite presenting my credentials, despite owning the very helicopter I was preparing to fly, I was met with resistance, with doubt, and with open hostility. And while this incident was deeply personal, it reflects a larger issue, an issue that so many people in our country face every day." He looked out at the crowd, meeting the eyes of the journalists, the cameras, the people who were listening. This is about systemic prejudice. It's about a culture that allows individuals to make judgments without facts, to act on biases rather than on truth. And it's about the consequences that those actions have. Consequences that, for many, are far more severe than what I experienced yesterday. Elijah could see the expressions in the room shift, some nodding in agreement, others scribbling notes, their attention fully on him. "I'm here today not just to talk about what happened to me," he continued, "but to talk about what comes next. This cannot be allowed to fade into another story that's here today and forgotten tomorrow. We need real change, systemic change. And that starts with accountability." He took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling over the room. "I'm calling on the aviation industry, on private terminals, and on law enforcement to re-examine their protocols, to implement training that addresses implicit bias, and to ensure that no one, regardless of their background, is treated as less than what they are." The room remained silent, the gravity of his message palpable. Elijah looked out at the crowd, his gaze steady, and to those watching, those who have faced similar situations, I want you to know, you are not alone. Your voice matters, and together we can demand the change that is long overdue. He stepped back from the podium, the room erupting in a flurry of activity. Reporters shouting questions, the clicks of cameras capturing his image. Elijah raised a hand, indicating that he was finished, and stepped away, Rebecca guiding him toward the exit. As they left the room, Clara met him in the hallway, her eyes shining with pride. "You did great, Elijah," she said softly, her hand resting on his arm. He nodded, the adrenaline still coursing through him. Now we wait and hope that people listen. By the evening, the story had taken over the airwaves. Elijah's press conference was replayed on major news networks, his words dissected and analyzed by pundits and commentators. Social media was ablaze with discussions, some supporting him, others dismissing the incident as an overreaction. But the overwhelming sentiment was one of solidarity, of a shared demand for change. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering their support and applauding his stance. A well-known senator tweeted his endorsement of Elijah's call for accountability, promising to bring the issue to the Senate floor. The momentum was building, and Elijah could feel the tide turning. But amidst the flood of messages, one in particular stood out, a video message from a young black woman, barely out of her teens. She spoke directly into the camera, her voice trembling but filled with conviction. Mr. Brooks, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for speaking up, for showing us that it's okay to demand respect, to stand up against people who try to put us down. I've been afraid to speak up my whole life, but seeing how you handled it, it's given me courage. I want to be a pilot someday, just like you. And now I believe I can. Elijah watched the video, his chest tightening. This was why he was doing it. For people like her, for the next generation that deserved to inherit a better world than the one he had grown up in. He forwarded the message to Clara, adding a simple note. This is why it matters. The evening wore on, and the weight of the day began to settle in. Elijah knew there would be challenges ahead, that change wouldn't come easily, and that there would be those who resisted, who tried to undermine his efforts. But he also knew that this was bigger than him. The response from the public, the support from people across the country, it was a reminder that he wasn't alone. He stood by the window of his home, looking out at the city lights, the glow of Los Angeles spreading out to the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, but he had always thrived in uncertain conditions. He was a pilot, after all, trained to navigate through turbulence, to find a path even when the skies were dark, and now, with the voices of so many behind him, Elijah felt ready to take on whatever lay ahead. He was determined to turn this storm into something meaningful, to ensure that the turbulence of today would lead to a clearer, better future. It had been 3 months since the incident at the private terminal in Los Angeles, and Elijah Brooks stood in front of a packed conference hall in Washington, D.C. The large room was filled with airport managers, security chiefs, civil rights leaders, and representatives from aviation companies from across the country, all there for the National Aviation Security Conference. The air was charged with anticipation, the kind that comes when a long overdue conversation is about to take place. It was time to present the changes that had since become known as the Brooks Standards. Elijah looked out at the audience, noting the rows of people in crisp suits and uniforms, badges shining under the bright lights. Cameras were set up at the back of the room, and he could feel the weight of their lenses on him. He took a deep breath. This was the culmination of months of work, an effort that had grown out of a moment of injustice and blossomed into something far greater. Standing beside him was Olivia Grant, now officially the lead on Skylift Aviation's new Compliance and Equality Division. Together, they were going to present a vision of how the aviation industry could change, could become more inclusive and respectful to everyone who walked through its gates, regardless of their background. Elijah stepped forward to the podium. The murmurs in the audience died down as the room turned its focus toward him. "Good morning, and thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "It's been a challenging few months, but also an inspiring one. We're gathered here not just because of what happened to me on that morning in Los Angeles, but because we have an opportunity, a responsibility, to ensure that what happened to me does not happen again, not to me and not to anyone else." He paused, scanning the audience, his gaze meeting the eyes of the security officers and aviation leaders who sat silently, listening. On that day, I was treated not as a business owner or a licensed pilot, but as someone who didn't belong, simply because of the assumptions made about me. What happened at that terminal wasn't unique, and we all know it. It is symptomatic of an industry-wide problem that affects people of color, people from marginalized communities, and anyone who doesn't fit a narrow profile of what is expected or acceptable. The room remained quiet, the weight of his words settling over the audience. Since then, Elijah continued, we have worked tirelessly to develop what we are calling the Brooks Standards, a comprehensive set of guidelines aimed at eliminating implicit bias in the aviation sector. Today, I stand here with Olivia Grant, who has been instrumental in implementing these standards at Skylift, to share our progress and, more importantly, our vision for the future. He gestured toward Olivia, who stepped forward with a smile, taking over the presentation. Behind her, a large screen lit up with statistics and bullet points that outlined the new standards: mandatory diversity training for all staff, updated protocols for verifying identities that focused on the documents and facts rather than appearances, and the implementation of new body cameras for security personnel at private terminals. These are not just guidelines, Olivia said, her voice confident. They are enforceable policies. Every single Skylift employee has undergone intensive training, focusing on bias recognition and the proper methods for interacting with passengers. We have installed new security cameras and hired third-party auditors to ensure compliance. We're committed to creating an aviation experience that treats all passengers with dignity and respect. As she spoke, Elijah watched the faces in the audience, some nodding in approval, others scribbling notes, a few looking thoughtful as they processed the information. He could see the shift in attitudes, the recognition of the need for change. This was what he had been fighting for. Olivia wrapped up her part of the presentation, and Elijah stepped back to the podium. We've already seen the impact of these changes, he said. Since implementing the Brooks Standards, complaints related to discrimination at Skylift have decreased by 80%. Passenger satisfaction has increased, and we've even seen a rise in interest from minority communities who now feel safer and more valued as customers. He paused, looking out at the audience with a determined expression. But we can't stop here. I'm calling on the entire aviation industry to join us in this effort. This is not just a Skylift issue, it's an industry issue, and it will take all of us to make meaningful progress. It will take commitment, resources, and, most importantly, a willingness to change the way we think. The audience broke into applause, and Elijah felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. It was a small step, but it was progress. As the applause died down, the regional director of the Los Angeles terminal stood up, raising his hand for the microphone. He looked toward Elijah, his expression earnest. Mr. Brooks, he began, on behalf of our terminal, I want to sincerely thank you for leading the charge on this. We have already begun implementing similar training programs at our facility, and I'm proud to say that we are seeing a difference. I think I speak for everyone here when I say that this industry needed a wake-up call, and you provided that. Elijah nodded, the warmth of the audience's response giving him hope. He had fought for this change not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, who had ever been judged not on their qualifications but on their appearance. It was for the young black woman who had sent him that video message, for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The conference continued with discussions on how the new standards could be implemented across different sectors of aviation. Elijah sat through the sessions, participating in roundtable discussions, answering questions, and sharing his experiences. The energy in the room was palpable. People were ready to make a change, and it was happening because of his efforts. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over Washington, Elijah stood by a large window in the conference hall looking out at the city below. The Washington Monument stood tall in the distance, bathed in the golden light of dusk. Olivia joined him, handing him a glass of water. "You did good today," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Elijah nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. We did good. This is only the beginning, but it feels like we're finally moving in the right direction. She smiled, clinking her glass gently against his. To change. They stood there in silence for a moment, taking in the scene before them. Elijah thought of all the people who had supported him on this journey. Clara, who had been his rock through the difficult days, his colleagues who had rallied behind him, and the countless individuals who had shared their own stories of injustice, using his platform to amplify their voices. He knew that the road ahead was still long. There would be setbacks, resistance, and challenges that would test his resolve. But for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt like they were on the verge of something transformative. Something that could change the face of an industry that had been stagnant for too long. The next day, Elijah had meetings with several industry leaders who had approached him after the conference. They wanted his input on how to roll out similar initiatives at their own terminals and within their own companies. He could feel the momentum building, the idea that maybe, just maybe, the change they were working toward could become a new standard for the entire aviation world. He returned to Los Angeles later that week, tired but filled with hope. As he walked through the Skylift headquarters, he saw the changes they had implemented. Staff members undergoing training in a conference room, posters about equality and bias awareness on the walls, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Rebecca met him in his office, her face lighting up as he entered. "You've been busy," she said with a smile, holding up a stack of letters. "These are all for you. Messages from people who watched the press conference, who saw what happened. Most of them are just thank yous." Elijah took the stack from her, flipping through the letters. He paused at one, a neatly folded piece of stationery with a young girl's handwriting. "Dear Mr. Brooks," it began, "thank you for speaking up for people like me. I've always dreamed of being a pilot, but I was scared I wouldn't be welcome. Now, because of you, I believe I can do it." Elijah smiled, setting the letter aside. He looked up at Rebecca. "Let's reach out to her. I want to invite her to come visit the headquarters, maybe even take a flight." Rebecca beamed. "Absolutely, Mr. Brooks. I'll make it happen." That evening, Elijah drove home, the sky above him painted in shades of orange and pink. He felt a sense of calm he hadn't felt in months. He knew that the fight wasn't over, far from it, but he also knew that he was making a difference. That young girl, those people who had sent him letters, the faces in the crowd at the conference, they were the reason he was doing this. They were the reason he kept fighting, even when it was hard. When he arrived home, Clara was waiting for him in the garden, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating the space. She looked up as he approached, her face breaking into a smile. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice filled with warmth. Elijah sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "It went well. Better than I could have hoped." She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, Elijah." He squeezed her hand, looking up at the stars above. "It's not just about me, Clara. It's about everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. We're making progress, but there's still so much to do." She nodded, her eyes closing as she relaxed against him. One step at a time. And as they sat there, the world around them quieting into the night, Elijah knew that she was right. One step at a time, they would keep moving forward. They would keep fighting, keep demanding change until the skies were clear for everyone, until everyone could fly without fear, without prejudice, without judgment. It was a long journey, but Elijah was ready for it. After all, he had spent his life in the skies, navigating through storms. And now, he was ready to help others take flight too, to soar beyond the barriers that had once held them down. The future was uncertain, but it was filled with possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah Brooks felt like he was truly soaring. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We've got more incredible stories waiting for you, so check out our other videos too. And if this story moved you, share it with others. Sometimes a story can spark a change.